Mataji, I feel really extremely happy that I could come to a place like Dallas and also could come across a person of your time who, in a very exemplary manner, has been taking care of this Vedanta society, to which hundreds and hundreds of people in the locality are attracted, and they find their tremendous spiritual nourishment here. There is no easy task. That too, we have embraced monastic life. Long, long ago, even in India it is said that embracing monastic life and carrying it out to its logical conclusion is nothing easy. It is an extremely difficult task. To venture to have a life of that kind itself is something very heroic and something, a beautiful illustration of a human achievement. So in this background, you have been highly successful in maintaining this Vedanta Center for the past several years, in addition to having been an exemplary personality in the field of monasticity, and definitely a good source of inspiration for the present day generation, whether it is in America or in India. With this background, I would like to ask you, how at all you got drawn to this? What is your background? Which place you come from? And how did your background made you turn your face towards this very seriously? What is your background, please?
Well, I grew up in Seattle, Washington. That's in the northwest part of America. And it's a very rainy place, not as bad as Cherrapunji, but there are a lot of gray, rainy days. So I decided that I would go to college in a place where it was sunny, Los Angeles. And I received a full scholarship, so I went to Occidental College, and that was in 1967, right during the Cultural Revolution. That was during the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was Watergate. There was just a whole revolution going on. It was a hotbed of Indian gurus, but it wasn't my first year that I noticed the spiritual part of what was happening in Los Angeles. I was in a college where the religious studies requirement had first come into the curricula. In the 1967, the 1960s were a movement in America called the Great Church Exodus, where 2/3 of Christians and Jews left their synagogues and their churches because of a distrust in authority.
Was it the time that the hippie movement started sprouting?
1967 was probably at the time, right at the peak of the so-called hippie movement. It was a distrust of authority, not only governmental, for what was happening in Vietnam, but in the church, what was happening within the church.
Okay.
It was a money-making business, and also there were many irregularities especially towards the children, that was going on. And so there was a deep distrust. And at that time, a lot of our Vietnam War vets were coming back traumatized. In Vietnam, they had asked their priests or their ministers or chaplains to help them get out of Vietnam, and received no help, so they began to get a sense of the Asian tradition, that there is suffering in this world. And when they returned to America and underwent psychoanalysis, they turned to the East. So at this time, there was a great ferment in religions, and the West turned to the East. I was, one of those turning to the East was the introduction of comparative religions in college curricula.
Right.
The other incident was Nostre Aetate by the Catholic Church to engage in interfaith dialogue with traditions of the world.
Okay.
A very big deal. And we were considered the high church of Hinduism because of what we were. And this lineage going back to Vivekananda's first appearance at the Chicago Parliament of Religions. So I was taking a comparative religions course, and the book was written by Houston Smith, Religions of Man. And he was one of the presidents of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis. But interestingly enough, the chapter on Hinduism was my least favorite. Coming from a monotheistic background, Christianity, the idea of so many gods and goddesses was repulsive. How could this be? And I felt that Houston did not really explain the monistic approach. And the various aspects were simply aspects to that ultimate reality. I didn't know much about Hinduism, but in my first year of college, my father passed away.
Okay.
Now, I was raised Christian, but when I was 12 years old, my parents broke away from the church. Why? Because the minister, and they were Episcopalian, Anglican, the minister, his wife had just passed away, and 6 months later he had remarried. And in those days, my father being a school teacher, parishioners, they tithed 10% of their income to the church. So my mother and father thought, why are we spending so much money on a church where the minister, his mind is not on God? And so my mother decided to teach us, there were 3 children in the family, the stories from the Bible. And she was a wonderful storyteller. I was 12 years old at the time, and I still remember that. She was also very artistic. She drew flannel background, so I could see where Jesus lived, and her wonderfully eloquent stories touched my heart. But by the time I was in college, I was agnostic. I was a political activist. I was one of the members of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and was very much involved in the Watts riots. Spokesman for the Watts riots came to our college and spoke out against the segregation and the civil rights that was not being observed. So it was at that time my father died. And suddenly my world changed. And I began to ask the big questions. Is this all that is? Is this it? And I had grown up in a church where we went to church on Sundays, and that was it. You came home and you went about your life. And so it seemed that religion was a bandage for something, that it wasn't really true. It was something you did. It was culturally accepted. And so these questions that came from deep within were like a prayer, except they weren't formulated in a prayer. It was like a terrible pain in the heart. This world seemed gray and empty. So my professor of comparative religions was divinity school trained. In those days, they weren't trained through the religious studies departments. They were trained in divinity school. So the idea that they were a Calvinist minister or a Protestant minister did not decry their academic standard. Whereas today, if you happen to be a Presbyterian minister and a religious studies scholar, you never make a claim that you are a Presbyterian minister. But he was a Calvinist minister who was my professor. We were reading Houston Smith's book. I was more attracted to Buddhism than anything else. And he said, we're going to the Vedanta temple to meet the spiritual grandson of Ramakrishna. Now, we knew in his book, Religions of Man, that in the index, these Vedanta centers were highly acclaimed. And we knew about Ramakrishna, we knew about Vivekananda, and I thought, who could the spiritual grandson of Ramakrishna be? So we had taken field trips to various synagogues, mosques, churches, Pentecostal churches, and we went to the little Hollywood temple, the Vedanta temple. And I remember to this day walking into the temple, and there was Swami Pravrajaka on the shrine dais giving a Bhagavad Gita class. And I was right at the door, and I knew when I looked at him that he was a man of God, and that religion was true. And it wasn't what he said, I couldn't remember what he said, but I had the darshan of a holy man. And it was the first time in my life that I had seen a holy man. And so I started researching and discovered that there was a Vedanta temple in Santa Barbara. And so I drove to Santa Barbara, and I remember driving into the grounds, and I had an overwhelming feeling that this was my home. I'd never had that experience before in my life. And I remember there was a woman from the Midwest. She was living in the gatehouse. She wore a shower cap to protect her hair. She was raking the eucalyptus pods under the beautiful eucalyptus trees. And she looked at me up and down, and the first words she spoke to me were, "Vedanta is not for intellectuals." She knew I was a college student. So I asked some questions and found out that Swami Pravrajaka was away looking at land in Arizona. Somebody had offered him land. And I had the opportunity to meet the assistant minister. And he introduced me to Vivekananda's 4 yogas, which I absolutely inhaled. And a month later, I met Swami. And in the meantime, I had met the nuns. And from what I had seen in Los Angeles of so many pop gurus and so much of a drug culture, they looked so normal to me. And that appealed to me, that there was something very strong and stable and normal about these women. And when I was sitting on the temple steps in Santa Barbara, and you can Google Santa Barbara Temple and go on a virtual tour of the temple grounds to see how beautiful it is. It's up in the mountains, and it's about 10 minutes from the ocean. So it's right in a very Mediterranean-looking town. I was sitting on the temple steps with a former screen actress, Virginia Gilmore, who was married to The King and I, Yul Brynner. And she asked me a little bit about myself, and she had been a long time disciple of Swami's. And this little man in a Panama hat and a blue sweater and trousers with a cane walked into the driveway, and I thought, could this be a Swami? Could this be the Swami? And immediately he asked me, he said, "Who is so-and-so?" which was my pre-monastic name. And I said, "I am Swami." And he spoke to me Christ's words, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." And he said to Virginia Gilmore, "You will have the first interview." And by the time I got into the study, before I could say anything, he smiled so beautifully and leaned forward in his chair across the desk and said, "I want you to be a nun." And during that month when I was reading Swamiji, that idea had become firmly planted in my heart, and I thought, what is this crazy nonsense? I didn't even like the word nun. I was going to be a teacher, a political activist. I was going to change the world. So all of this revolution was going on within me, and Swami gave me some initial instructions and told me to associate for a year with the nuns, because at that time it was so novel to join a convent or monastery such as Vedanta that it was much wiser to be on the outside and associate closely. And for a year, and then pass the medical and pass the character tests and so forth. So I went away walking on cloud 9. And after 3 years in college, this was towards the end of that 3 years, I withdrew from college and moved to Santa Barbara so I could closely associate with the nuns. And every time Swami came to Santa Barbara, he came twice a month for 5 days at a stretch, I would come to the convent and there was a little cot in the laundry room and I would sleep on that. And that also happened to be where the convent watchdogs came to eat their dog food in the morning. So every morning the dogs would come out, lick my face, and I would jackknife in my cot, but it was heaven on earth. Because during that time, Swami stayed in the convent in a little room off from the main house and took all of his meals there. And in the evening, after the Arati service, the nuns would gather their knitting and crocheting, their ghee lights, and they would sit in the living room, and a senior nun would read from the Gospel of Ramakrishna, and Swami would reminisce about the direct disciples of Ramakrishna and the oral tradition of Sri Ramakrishna, Sarada Devi, and Vivekananda. Some stories that have never been told. And that was a time that I can still remember the feeling.
You think just because the Swami asked you that you were destined to be a nun, as though it was a commandment from him, in a firm voice, you are born to be a nun or something of that kind which you said. Was it enough for you to embrace such a high ideal as monasticism?
The Swami knew that I had tendencies before he'd heard from the nuns that I was beginning to wonder if this was the life that I should live. And it was a radical change that happened within a month's time. From someone who couldn't bear the word nun, who thought nuns were depressed women, living behind the Holy Grail, retreating from life, to this kind of life in a religion that was not rooted in American soil. It's a very, very different, it was a very different time then. But he heard from the nuns, they liked me, and they knew that I was extremely interested. And at first glance, that is what he said. But I went through a period in that year's time where I vacillated back and forth. And at one point I left and went on retreat into Colorado, a 2-month retreat to get away. And when I came back, I knew that to live in Santa Barbara, I would have to get a job and work. And so I applied various places, but I hadn't finished my college. And there were many people who applied at this one place where I had applied. So I figured I probably wouldn't be able to stay in Santa Barbara, which had a very high standard of living. So I told Swami. And he said, well, you tell the senior nuns. Then the phone rang. And it was my future boss who said, you have the job. So I put the phone down and I said, Swami, I'm going to stay. And during that time when I vacillated back and forth, finally he said to me, it's harder than you think. And at that moment, I knew that that was the only goal in life that I wanted. Something that was that high.
So nice to hear.
So it was in 1971, I was working And Swami wanted me to finish my last year of college. He said, you must always finish what you start. A fire broke out in the hills behind Santa Barbara, a huge forest fire. And so I left work, went up, evacuated the nuns, and the fire broke the fire line twice. And when it was finally put out, I helped the nuns move in, and I moved myself in. And Swami said, finish your last year, you can live here. So he made an exception. And that was 1971.
It was in 1971 exactly that you were initiated into sannyasa also?
No, no. 1971, I moved into the convent. I officially joined in January 1973 and sannyasa in 1984. Brahmacharya in 1979, and that was after that I went to my first pilgrimage to India.
1984.
And 1984 was sannyas.
Okay. You were given sannyas here itself, or you had been to India for that purpose?
No, Brahmacharya was given in Hollywood. And along with that, 2 men were given Brahmacharya after our batch, and then sannyas was given to a number of women. So it was a large batch of initiated monks and nuns, and that was during Swami Swanananda's time. And my Brahmacharya guru was Swami Asheshananda, disciple of Holy Mother.
Okay.
Swami Prabhavananda passed away in 1976. And my sannyas guru was also Swami Asheshananda. And at that time I took sannyas alone in Santa Barbara. So
was he in charge of Portland at that time?
he was in charge, but Bellarmine ruled that the senior-most Swami in the country would be giving the vows of Brahmacharya or sannyas, and 4 heads of center must be present. And in Southern California there were about 50 monastics. So monastics from our Southern California center would attend, and also from San Francisco. We invited always 2 nuns from the convent there, and when they would have their Brahmacharya and sannyas, 2 nuns from our Santa Barbara and 2 nuns from our Hollywood center would also go up to their
Perhaps you were very young at the time you were initiated into sannyas.
I was, yes, because I joined the convent when I was 22. So that was...
Just 5 years later you were given sannyas. That means to say...
22 years old, 1973 and 1979, Brahmacharya, and then 1984 after that.
5 years.
Yes, 5 years after Brahmacharya.
So you were not even 30 at the time you became a sannyasini.
Perhaps. 1984, it's hard for me to do the math right off the top of my head, but yeah, I was pretty young. In fact, in India, I remember Swami at Vastananda, he was the assistant secretary of the order at that time. He thought I was only 16 years old. I've always looked much younger than what I actually am. Yeah.
Is it due to the spiritual power that you had developed within the
I wish.
So interesting. Yes. My next question actually is, of course, you are born in this country, you have been brought up in this country, and you have a lot of knowledge about the American spiritual background, cultural background, socio-economic background, and all that. America is a great country, no doubt about that. It has its own cultural roots. We have this Concord movement, this transcendental movement. Even before Vivekananda's appearance here on the soil of America, there was a transcendental movement that had left some deep roots into the minds of Americans. Exactly almost at that time, Vivekananda appeared. Just then had concluded the tussle between the southern part of America and the northern part of America about this Negro issue and all that. So this political issue was moving towards its firm settlement, and the socio-cultural forces were by that time already settled. Exactly at that time, Vivekananda appeared, as well as my little knowledge about Vivekananda's background. The background of Vivekananda's appearance on the soil of America is concerned. You think Vivekananda did really contribute anything for the cultural enrichment of America, or the reorientation of America into wider realms of how the spirituality should be, how
Well,
richness of culture should be?
I think if you look at the Smithsonian Institute, they nominated 29 eminent foreign visitors for contributing to America, and he was one of the 29 for the spiritual, indelible spiritual impression he left in America.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And that we see in so many ways. When I was in the Santa Barbara convent, right across the street lived Prasanna, whose great aunt was Josephine McLeod. And we heard so many stories about Tontine. And Prasanna, as a 3-year-old child, she had sat on Vivekananda's lap at Ridgely Manor. And her mother, she was a very worldly woman, but she loved to converse with Vivekananda. He was the most stimulating conversationalist she'd ever met. And how did this woman die? Very interesting. And this is only by oral tradition. Prasanna's,
can you please name the name of that? Can you name that woman?
Whitmarsh. It was Whitmarsh. It was Whitmarsh. Because Prasanna's name was Catherine Whitmarsh. And the president of the Vedanta Society of Southern California is a Whitmarsh. So today, Carl Boris is a Whitmarsh. If you ever go there, you can find these stories.
Yes, yeah.
But when we were interviewing Prasanna, her mother passed away, and the maid came running to Prasanna and said, "Madam, madam, madam's hair is standing on end." She had horripilations at the time of her passing. And yet, the only way she engaged with Vivekananda was through conversation. So what Vivekananda gave in conversation was transmitted to her.
Okay. Was she in any way related with S.K. Blodgett?
No, Blodgett was from another family.
Okay.
Catherine Whitmarsh, her great aunt was Tontine. And so she knew Tontine, she heard stories of Tontine, and Tontine passed away in our Southern California Center.
Oh.
Along with Ida Ansel, who was Ujjala, and along with Sister Lalita, who was one of the Mead sisters in the Vivekananda house. So those 3 women passed away in Southern California Center, and Swami Prabhavananda used to say that we know Vivekananda came 3 times to Southern California.
My goodness. No greater tribute can ever be there.
So many oral tradition stories came through those women of Vivekananda. Yeah.
You remember what time Josephine McLeod passed away? Which year? Which year she
When she passed away?
Yeah.
Around 1949.
49.
Yeah, so Sister Lalita as well. Yeah. Ida Ansel a little bit later in the 50s, early 50s. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So this is something that makes us have a real look towards Sanatana Dharma, and it makes us feel proud of the greatness of Sanatana Dharma, at least in the light of the teachings of Swami Vivekananda. How do you feel that Sanatana Dharma has got a role to bring within its fold all the true and the sincere seekers after truth?
One of the things that I tell Western newcomers who are recovering Catholics, I call them, Catholics who have left the church or Christians who have left Christianity, is that in our tradition, you not only get to ask questions, you must ask questions. Whereas in the Christianity that they are familiar with, you don't question. Whereas in Vedanta, the right question brings the right answer. So we understand a person's spiritual development by the questions they ask. And questioning is very important. And that's why our study circles are interactive. Where we are, for example, we have a Raja Yoga study circle here, and I will lead it, but I search for the answers in the members of the study circle because I believe that there is wisdom in the group, and without that interactive process, the knowledge is not assimilated. Ashokananda Swami used that technique. He said, first of all, he said, it's okay if you're not sure, but don't have vague understanding. And so, question. And so that is very reassuring to those who have left the church, where their questions were disregarded or looked down upon, or they were punished for them. So that's number one. Number two is the Sanatana Dharma is such an ancient, organic tradition. It did not seek to conquer, but it developed through osmosis. Sankhya philosophy, Kopila was a seer. He was a seer. So the religion was established from the revelation. It's not a theology. It's not built by theologians. It's built by seer philosophers. And on top of Sankhya came Patanjali. So from a Vichara tradition, we find Patanjali adopting the 24 cosmic principles, introducing the personal God, pranayama, and we move on to Shankara, who accepts the 24 cosmic principles, and out of that tradition we find introducing mother worship, the Pancha Naivedyam, the 64 Uchara. It was organic religion that drew on whatever was useful. And Ramana Maharshi comes along hundreds of years later, and he introduces the Vipashanti technique of Koham, Saham, Naham through pranayama, breath control. So when I went to India alone, I wanted to see the cave temples. I've always been drawn to the cave temples. And what I saw at Ajanta and Ellora just blew me away. There were the Hindu temples, next to the Buddhist temples, next to the Jain temples. So these cave temples were think tanks, where these rishis would share ideas, debate, and through that, new ideas would spring up. From Jnana Yoga, Buddhism sprang and took practices from